Hello, my name is Scott Dobbins. I'm a retired firefighter for City of Marietta, Georgia. I've been creating some videos explaining issues being faced by the retirees and employees at City of Marietta, Georgia. I worked for the city for almost 30 years, and to be honest with you, I always loved the job being a firefighter, but put up with some really sorry leadership when you get down to brass tacks. And I've been making these videos kind of letting people, know some of the history of what their benefits are, where they derive, and different things. But I've had a couple people ask me, why do you care? You're retired. Move on with your life. Forget about the past. Well, no, that's not how I roll, unfortunately. So I decided to make this video, and there's going to be a series here. It's going to be on 3 different people. Nancy Martin, personnel director, who's retired out of there. And that was the first person I really started having problems with. And then Jackie Gibbs, who was fire chief, problems out of that guy. And then Bill Bruton, city manager there, had problems out of him. And surely I'm not the only one that's been affected by this, but what the kind of the gist of this video is, I think doesn't matter where you work, especially if you're working for any type of government, you should document any type of piece of paper you get, any type of change, even if you got just a little logbook you come up with. It sounds stupid, but I have got boxes and boxes and boxes of documents. I retired under the 4022 pension plan, and I even have a master copy of that document when it was presented to the mayor and council. So this is an original one. It's unadulterated by all the changes that end up kind of happening over years. So what I found is when you work for places, they're bad to give you a piece of paper that you might want to pencil whip, or what we call pencil whip is, in other words, I'll give you an example. I worked at Home Depot, and a lady came out one time and said, here, sign this form. And I was a new employee working there part-time, and I read the form, and I look at her, and I said, this says I've had the forklift driving class. And she goes, yeah, just go ahead and sign it. And I said, I'll sign it when I take the class. No, you can go ahead and sign it now. I said, honey, I worked in the fire service for a long time. I've seen a lot of forms that people pencil whip. I said, I'm not pencil whipping anything. I'll sign it after I've had the class. Got it? And she just walked away. So, and I'll give you another example. I worked at City of Alpharetta, Georgia, as a part-time firefighter back in the 90s. And it was when they were in a growth stage. So they hired a bunch of part-time guys who kind of had experience or more experience than some of the people they were hiring, kind of make things go a little smoother. And we had a class one day up in Alpharetta, and it was over drug and alcohol testing policy that had came out and different things. And at the end, the guy passes out a form. Well, I'm reading the form. I looked at the guy and said, I'm not signing this form. I'm one of the part-timers. And the guy goes, why not? And I said, I have no problem taking a drug and alcohol test. I said, but this form releases the City of Alpharetta, City of Alpharetta Fire Department, City of Alpharetta Police Department, the testing company. It releases everybody. I said, if you want to test me, that's fine, but I'm not releasing anybody. Well, he don't know what to do about it. So anyhow, I go to, the guy's name was Chief Bates. I went to Chief Bates. He goes, I agree with you. He goes, but you have to file a grievance on it. So I filed a grievance to the personnel department, and basically saying, I don't have a problem taking your test. You want me to take a test, you just need to be liable for any of the actions. You can't ask me to give up my constitutional rights to protect myself. So had a guy ask, well, what does it matter? Why don't you just sign it? And I said, well, I said, for example, it says if you're involved in an accident that you have to be tested. I said, it doesn't say that if you're at fault. It says if you're involved. I said, picture I'm driving one of your engines and I'm sitting in a traffic light. I'm just sitting stopped at the light and all of a sudden get rear-ended. We get back out, check on the person, everything else, and they're hammered. And next thing you know, I'm getting alcohol tested because I was involved in an accident. You send me off to get tested. And let's say in this case, the person that rear-ended me was a councilman for that town. And all of a sudden now, I'm the one that's intoxicated, not him. And all of a sudden I lose my job there as part-time. And you kind of have a fiduciary duty to call the place I work at full-time and say, hey, this guy failed a drug test. He was drinking while he was driving a fire truck for us. So now that cost me another job. So you see why I'm not going to sign that? Because I'm not releasing anybody of something like that. So anyhow, he's like, okay. So anyhow, grievance goes in. And kid you not, that very day, There was a city employee for Alpharetta driving a street sweeper going down the road, and the street sweeper was supposed to have water injection on it so that, and this has been a long time ago, so supposed to have water injection, and the injectors didn't work, so he was creating a dust cloud going down the road. Well, the reality, he's running a street sweeper. He's creating a dust cloud probably kind of anyhow. It didn't matter. He got rear-ended by a young man, and it killed the young man driving the vehicle. We had to kind of cut him out. So, I mean, we were on the call. Well, when that type of thing happens, if you've been around government long enough, you knew your little grievance that you filed wasn't going to be very important that day. Now, what they should have done is came to me and said, hey, we're going to hold this off a little while if you don't mind. Okay, don't worry about signing paperwork. You know, we'll discuss this later. Oh, I knew what was coming. So sure enough, get called in Chief Bates' office, and he said, hey, they said either sign the paper, quit, or be terminated. I handed him a resignation letter. So lost part-time job because I wouldn't sign a form. Now, was I right to do that? Well, to give you an example, that guy's driving a street sweeper up there. They didn't have any maintenance department to speak of back in those days. They might have one now if they didn't have crap back then. This guy's just out there doing his job as a city guy, driving the truck they assigned him to. Some poor young man hits him, caused that young man's life. But they charged the driver of that street sweeper with manslaughter, vehicular homicide. Charged him with vehicular homicide. He got rear-ended, but they was scapegoating. That's the way they reacted. Punish somebody, punish somebody, punish somebody. And if I'm not mistaken, the way it worked out was that guy ended up getting an attorney. The attorney come in and said, I need the maintenance records for the truck, and all that kind of went away. But at that point, he's already hired an attorney. I don't know if he lost his job or not, but I wouldn't work for a place that treated me like that. So, now let's go to Marietta. I worked at the city just about a year, and we ended up in a lawsuit with the city over our pension plan. So I learned kind of quick they were willing to modify things for their benefit, because I don't care where you're at. You can be working in one of the best cities that's out there. You're one election away from having a bunch of crapbag politicians that could care less about you. That's as simple as it gets. Matter of fact, this is December 31st, 2025. Look around at what's going on in our country, how corrupt it is, and it mostly involves elected officials. It is horrid what's going on. Some of these people out there are whistleblowers trying to point out that there's problems. Billions of dollars being sent overseas to who knows where. We're living in a bad time, and it's not got better, it's got worse since I was a younger guy. Like I said, the thing with the pension plan, I kind of learned kind of quick, okay, that's the way they're going to do things, right? But at the city, and I don't know if anybody knows or not, there was a time frame when they cared more about employee retention. Now, this is flow over from, I think, more the 70s and early 80s, nothing to do with Nancy Martin, but there was a time when they, I think, were more concerned about keeping employees. A tenured employee can be a really good person. I shouldn't say tenured because that's more of a college thing. A senior employee that knows a lot can help you out a bunch. So with the city, they came out with a program that they would pay part of your college classes. And it was based on your grade. You got so much money, A, B, or C, D, you didn't get nothing. And it was back during the days of quarter system. So I was taking a fire science program, and you had to go over and turn your paperwork in, and then after you got your grades, you went over there and turned your grades in. And you had to do this because they only allotted so much money. And I'll give you an example. There was one year a police officer took a rappelling class in Colorado somewhere, and he got every penny of it because it was only like, let's say, $5,000, and he got all of it to go to that class. But one of the quarters, I went over there and turned my grades, and Nancy Martin looked at me and goes, you didn't turn in your paperwork to go to class. And I said, yes, I did. She goes, well, no, you didn't. And I said, yeah, I did too. And she goes, no, you didn't. She goes, well, if you want to get paid, you're going to sign this form stating that you didn't turn your paperwork in, and that if you ever do it again, you won't get paid. And I said, I don't want to sign that. It's a lie. I turned in my paperwork. She goes, well, no, you didn't. And I said, she goes, if you want to be paid, Scott, sign the paperwork. So I signed the paperwork, turned it in. Next quarter rolls around. Take my grades over there to get paid. She goes, she looked straight at me and goes, I told you last time, if you didn't turn in your paperwork, you weren't going to get paid. And I said, Nancy, I turned in my paperwork just like I did the time before. And she goes, no, you didn't. And I said, well, it's funny. This lady sitting right there signed this document on this date saying she received my paperwork. Nancy shut up, took paperwork, walked away, ended up getting paid. Did she already know she was lying? I don't know. I mean, that's the type of crap you put up with. You're like, really? I'm over here trying to improve myself as an employee. If I make myself better, I'm better for the community. And anybody that's trying to do that that's benefiting the community ought to care. And so that was one of those, oh, brother. Well, later on down the road, the city had sent out a thing saying that they were going to start random drug testing employees. That's a big deal. They're going to start doing random drug testing. So I was in the car. Now, that's kind of fire department slang that you were the acting chief for the day, or you are the chief. So I was the acting assistant chief on that date. And Mark Anderson came downstairs and hands me a list of the first employees that are going to go through the random drug test at the fire department. I looked at the list and looked at him and I said, Mark, that's all 10 drivers. And we only had 10 drivers. I said, that's all 10 drivers. I said, that's a statistical impossibility in a random drug test to get all 10 drivers and only the 10 drivers. He just kind of said, well, I don't know, you have to call Nancy. So I called over and talked to Nancy. I said, Nancy, I said, this is a random drug test. I said, how in the world in a random drug test did y'all get all 10 drivers and only the 10 drivers? I said, that can't happen. And I said, and another thing is, I said, I can't get all of them in here to test anyhow. She goes, well, why not? I said, well, Tim Milligan, who's the current chief, I said, he's over at Dobbins Air Force Base on a training exercise. I said, I don't even know how to get in touch with him. He went over in a pickup truck. And I said, and I got 2 guys fighting a woods fire up on Kennesaw Mountain. I said, I'm not about to call them off that mountain and bring them in here to go through a drug test when I have no idea how the effects of being on that fire is liable to do to the drug test. She goes, well, who's on the drug test? And I'm not going to use the real names, but I'm going to say Dave and Tom. Well, most everybody go, Tom, we know who the hell that is. No. I'll use 2 more fictitious names. Robert and Bob. And she goes, but we want to test Bob. I said, Nancy, you just informed the union president that you are selectively choosing candidates in a random, hello. She hung up the phone. So needless to say, I didn't bring these guys in the drug test. So I got drug tested after that pretty regular. Now, one of the problems was that you really don't know all the rules. You're not going to know every rule out there until you research them. So I go down one of the Time State random drug tests. We're lined up and down the hall, just a bunch of guys standing there taking a piss test. And they're running people in and out of this room. And all of a sudden they walk this poor guy out, and he is as red-faced as he can be. And they've got him by the arm, they've got his paperwork, and they're walking him down through there. And here comes Nancy and people from HR, and they're all panicking. They walk him and go out the door with him. All of us employees watched that happen. My understanding was that he had popped false positive. He wasn't positive for a drug test. So what happens, as soon as you popped positive, you went to take a blood test, not a piss test or the mouth swab they were doing. So they took him up for a blood test. He ended up testing negative. But he had walked by all the employees. How embarrassing was that for this poor employee to go through this bullshit? So Nancy comes up to me, and I say, Nancy, we don't need to see this as employees. We don't need to see this type of thing happening. And she's like, yeah, I guess you're right and stuff. I said, there's conference rooms down there. All we got to do is go put everybody in the conference room. You can call them out and they go through the test. Well, I go and look city's testing policy up, and it quotes a DOT testing standard. And the DOT testing standard says if you're using public urinals, and that's what we were using. We were using a public urinal that had like 2 or 3 stalls and like 3 wall urinals, okay? If you're using a public urinal, they have to leave one, I believe it was a stall open, tape off everything else, and put a dye in it that's reactive to like pee, so that if you poured something in it, it'd go off. And the only person allowed in that entire bathroom at the time the sample is being given is the person given the sample. Okay. So sure enough, not long after that, come back down there. There they are, lined up and down the hallways. And I'm PO'd. And of course, I've got to go to a training exercise later on somewhere else. I'm down there, luckily, with a police officer and one of the drivers. And we had this little girl named Libby. Libby was a little tiny, quiet as a mouse type of person. And I'm down there explaining they're not supposed to be standing in the hallways, supposed to be down here in this room, because that's what Nancy said they were going to do. So you're not supposed to be doing this. And I said at this point, they're not supposed to be testing the way they're testing down there. So sure enough, get down there, and it is just a complete and utter fiasco. So now when I'm talking to Libby, I'm pissed off. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I'm mad because of the way they're treating people. Now, I didn't yell at Libby, but I am frustrated. So Libby's one of those little people you scare the crap out of her if the wind blows. So I go to the training exercise. Somebody's phone rings out there, says, hey, you need to be in the chief's office 5 minutes ago. So get down there, come in the chief's office. Chief Gibbs is having to come apart. You chewed out a clerk. I said, didn't chew out anybody. You cussed out. He got on that high horse, going to threaten to fire me and do all this shit. And it's like, you know what? I didn't chew anybody out. They're not following city code on the way they're supposed to test things. And he finally looks at me and goes, it's not your job to stand up for all these people. I said, no, it's yours, and you're not doing it. So if you're not doing it, I've got to do it, or somebody's got to do it. He goes, so finally, there's so many, what they do is if you got in a meeting with the chief, he was in there with all the chiefs, and so we're all sitting there kind of hammering it out. And luckily, they kind of backed off and said, you should have filed a grievance. I said, if I wasn't over at the base, I'd done filed a grievance. So filed a grievance, and what had happened is that day, Nancy had retired. We had a new HR director named Fran Dietrich, and so Libby was like the stand-in for Nancy that morning over there. And so I go over there to have a meeting over the grievance. And Fran is so worried about Libby getting her feelings hurt that it's just ridiculous. I said, look, if I hurt Libby's feelings, I apologize. She was sitting there. I said, if I hurt your feelings, I apologize. But here's the reality. Y'all aren't following the rules. And Fran goes, well, I know in the future there can only be so many more people in the bathroom, and I'm going to allow so many to test it. Well, I said, you don't have that authority. The only way you can change the number of people that are in that bathroom is the mayor and council have to amend the code. You have to follow the code. So she goes, well, that's how it's going to be in the future. They can be this many people in there. And I just leaned in and looked at her and I said, here's the deal. You ever test me like again, I'll sue your ass. Never was tested again after that. So, and to give you an idea, she was a HR director, and I'm pretty sure she was escorted out of City Hall after her little tenure. So, but let's go back to Nancy Martin here for a bit. I was on the pension board at the city for 3 terms. So 2 2-year terms and 1 3-year term. I ended up on the pension board because I was elected as a write-in candidate. I wasn't allowed on the ballot, even though I'd been nominated multiple times. And that's more the nobody's standing up for you, kind of situations over there. So when I was on the pension board, Nancy Martin, we had a guy at work named Ron. I'm not going to use his last name, named Ron, that worked over in fleet maintenance. They had went after him for basically stealing stuff from the city. And what they had was about $300 worth of tires and rims. I think it was like $320. And they had made a trailer. And they had worked it up with electrical use, shop time, all this different stuff to a felony level, over $1,000. And when they gave us the paperwork, I looked at them, I said, y'all understand that people that work at a shop, that's kind of a convenience working at a shop. You get to use the welders and different stuff that's over there. And they're going, well, no. And there was a councilman there named Philip Goldstein, and Philip's going, no, you work for the city, you don't use the stuff. And I said, hey, I've gone over there and they've turned brake drums and brake rotors for me. And I thought he was going to have a cum part sitting right there. I said, they did it after hours. Yeah, but they used the city electricity and the city equipment. I said, yeah, they did. I said, I didn't pay nothing for it, and they didn't make anything out of it. Well, that's wrong. I said, hold on a minute. I don't remember you people griping when I was tearing up my saw blades, cutting up buildings, and my chainsaws cutting up buildings to make mazes and different things to call through. That was my personal stuff that got destroyed. I said, this is just kind of working together as teams. I'm not getting over on anybody. So anyhow, he got highly upset that, anybody that took from the city, by gosh, that wasn't right. And I said, well, Philip, here's the problem. And I'll tell you right now. So the problem is if an employee does something, it's a blue-collar criminal investigation. I said if an elected official does something, it's a white-collar ethics investigation. He goes, nah, if a councilman steals tires, it needs to be investigated the same. I said, well, that's the problem. You won't be. And that was proved out later on with that very same gentleman. He didn't lose his pension. But they took Ron's pension. At one point, when they gave me paperwork, I wanted to find out more than what they were telling me, so I went over to Cobb County court system, and I talked to a guy, and I want to say his last name was Carter, and he was over the diversion programs. And what Ron said was, I had pled not guilty, and then had an attorney. He said it gave me bad advice, said, no, you just need to go ahead and plead guilty, but take the diversion program, and it'll cost you a lot less money than paying me to represent you all this stuff. And he goes, I was already losing my job. He goes, but if I'd known I was going to lose my pension, I'd never agreed to it. And talking to Mr. Carter from the court system over there, Carter goes, yeah, we told the city this is not worth our time. There's really not enough theft here or anything to warrant a felony. Y'all have kind of made up all this other additional stuff to make it over $1,000. He goes, but the guy's already losing his job. Just cut it and be done with it. And he said, no, your personnel director was adamant about, nope, taking this guy's pension or charging him with it. And I remember he looked at me and he goes, buddy, I feel sorry for you. He goes, if that's y'all's HR director, he goes, I feel sorry for you. He goes, I've never met a person that hates people as bad as that lady hates people. And that was pretty accurate. Now, where I have a problem with Nancy is I have forms, and that's going to kind of come in a cumulative state of all three of these people, Gibbs and Martin and Bruton, where they falsified a document that ended up costing me hundreds of thousands of dollars. No ifs, no ands, no buts about it. And she was adamant about taking somebody's pension over $1,200, and she falsified a form, violated city ordinance, and it's cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's part of the reason I'm making these videos, because I'm still mad about it. It might not be done with it. So everybody that works there, I'm telling you, y'all need to, especially at the city, but any place you work at, if you've got a phone, use one of those cam scanners or some sort of app, and to hand you paperwork, make a copy of it. If they give you a personnel manual and they want to take it back in, take it somewhere and make a copy of it, because they'll amend the rules and not tell you what they are. And it shouldn't be that way, but that's just the way it is. This is kind of a little closing note for the people that's working at the city. You're not paying Social Security and Medicare. Excuse me, you're not paying Social Security there. You're paying Medicare. But if you're going to be there, you need to start standing up for yourself. I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, you need to get the hell out of Dodge. And the reason being is you're doing yourself a disservice down the road. Because you're paying into something that if you don't stay there long enough to vest, that's 10 years you're going to lose in Social Security benefits. So if you're going to stay there and fight to make the place a better place to be. And that's as simple as it gets. All right. So I'm going to word off on this one. All right. That's kind of my reason for making these videos. Thanks for your time.